speak at a few of our different road shows, at a bunch of our different national meetings, and we're fortunate to have him here today. And Patrick Duffy from Eaton Vance is here to do an intro. And Patrick, thank you for being here, and Jeff, thank you for being here as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Before I do the intro of Jeff, I just want to thank everybody for having us here at your conference, and more importantly, thank you for being a wonderful partner to Eaton Vance throughout the year. I hope everybody has a happy, healthy, and prosperous new year. If there's anything that we can do at Eaton Vance, please come by our booth. Please reach out, whether you're in the field, whether you're in your home office, anything we can do to make your 2017 business more successful, more prosperous, it will be nothing but happy for us. So without much further ado, I do want to introduce our keynote speaker for the day. I don't think Jeff needs much of an introduction. We are very, very excited to be the sponsor of Jeff Bush today. I know that he has presented many times, many years for Jackson National, so I hope many of you have seen and had an opportunity to see his unbiased, nonpartisan approach and look at the Washington machine. With the 2017 historic election in our rearview mirror, I think now is the time that it really gets interesting and difficult to see the governing and the legislation that's going to change and shape our future, our business, and everything in between. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Bush.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. All right, we're going to spend about the next hour talking about taxes and politics. I know you're very excited about that, but I have to tell you, I had a little bit of an interesting experience walking in this morning. I have to admit, it's the very first time I've ever walked into a big ballroom like this, and I walked in a little bit late, but everyone was standing up undressing. And I thought, am I in the right place? I don't know that this is an audience ready to hear about politics and taxes. Quickly realized this was another Greg Seacott effort, so that made sense, and so I sat down to enjoy the show. I do appreciate the opportunity. How many of you have seen Andy or me present before? Okay, so a lot of you. So I'm going to cut right through the fluff and get right to what we want to talk about today. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Obviously, we're in a time of transition, moving to the new administration, and that always brings up a lot of new questions, especially when it's such an historic transition that we've gone through after the 2016 election. When I was sitting down thinking about what we should talk about today, I thought, we ought to spend at least a couple of minutes talking about the election. Not what happened, we all know what happened, but more importantly, why Donald Trump was elected, and get into a little bit of that detail. I'm still finding that's a consistent question that I get from clients and advisors around the country. But we're going to spend the vast majority of our time talking about the cornucopia of legislative initiatives and proposals that Donald Trump and the Republicans have set forth, where it's going to be an incredibly exciting year this year, and I want to lay that framework at a bit of more tactical level than we talked about earlier today. What we talked about earlier today was more the long term. I want to talk about the near term. And then we're going to end our time talking today about an interesting inflection point that we have for investors right now. We are in a period of transition for investors as well, and I want to spend a little time, and I think there's a unique opportunity for the work that you do with your financial advisors and their clients with this transition. So in order to get started, if we're going to talk about the election, we need to talk about what we know, but also what we don't know going into that election in November of this year. What we knew certainly is that Trump was hearing a different voice than the rest of the competitors in 2016, and we knew that they would show up on Election Day and vote for Donald Trump. But what we also knew is it was a change election year, and Hillary Clinton was anything but a change candidate. But this election was much more about what we didn't know heading into November election. What we didn't know going into the November election is whether the Obama coalition would actually hold together for Hillary Clinton. You see, the Democrats assumed all along that the Obama coalition was actually the Democratic coalition. What we found after the election, once we started to crunch those numbers, is that it was not the Democratic coalition, it was strictly the Obama coalition. Whether you look at millennial voters, African Americans, Latinos, Asian American voters, all the way down the line, Hillary Clinton underperformed President Obama in those categories. So that's one thing we didn't know. But I think what was more telling in 2016 was around the second Republican that showed up to vote. We knew the Donald Trump Republican would show up. After all, they sat out in a cold rain for 3 hours to see him in an unheated hangar. So we knew they were going to show up on Election Day. But the second Republican voter is what really threw him over the top. The second Republican voter is a Republican that showed up to make sure that President Hillary Clinton had to deal with a Republican Congress. But when they were there, they certainly weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton. So they went ahead and checked the box for Donald Trump. Fully 90% of Republicans actually ended up checking the box for Donald Trump. That's a significantly high percentage of Republican support. Now, there's also a geographical story that we're all very familiar with, but I want to break it down by party. And you can see that consistently Hillary Clinton underperformed President Obama across almost the entire United States, with basically 2 exceptions: South Florida and South Texas, both heavily Latino parts of our country. But what was interesting is Donald Trump also overperformed Mitt Romney in those same geographies. But this election was all about that industrial Midwest. And we've heard that ad nauseum, so we're not going to spend any more time on it. But I thought it would be helpful to talk a little bit about why the election went down the way it did. But again, we're going to spend the mass majority of our time talking about these legislative proposals that Donald Trump and the Republicans have put forward. While it is true the Republicans have a clean sweep on the legislative process, winning control of the Senate, the House, and the White House, it doesn't mean they have free rein to write any piece of legislation they want. There are 2 primary checks on any type of runaway presidential agenda, and I want to get into some depth on those 2 issues. The first one has to do with the fact that the Republicans only won a simple majority of the Senate, failing to get to the 60-vote threshold, which is called the filibuster minimum within the Senate. You see, in order to pass any piece of legislation in the Senate, you need to have 60 votes, not 51, and the Republicans only control 52. So they're well short of that 60-vote threshold. Now, there is an option that the Republicans have. They could simply bust the filibuster. As a matter of fact, Harry Reid busted the filibuster back in 2014 as it relates to presidential appointees, in other words, cabinet members, and federal judges, not for legislation or Supreme Court judges. Both of those issues still need to meet that 60-vote threshold. And while it's interesting that in order to pass a piece of legislation in the Senate, you need to have 60 votes, in order to change a rule within the Senate, guess how many votes you need? 51. So the Republicans, based on controlling 52 votes in the Senate, could bust the filibuster and allow the Republicans to pass legislation and/or Supreme Court justices with a simple majority. Now, I'm here to tell you we do not believe that's likely to happen. Even as the Senate has gotten more ruckus over the last several sessions and so forth, we do not believe that they'll actually bust the filibuster as it relates to Supreme Court justices or legislation. And the reason why is the Republicans know that it could be as short as 2 years before the Democrats are back in simple majority. And that would allow them to reverse any of those changes. There is a little bit of deference still left within the Senate about the traditions and longstanding rules within the Senate. So we don't think it's likely that that will happen. But this second issue called reconciliation, and be prepared, you're going to get sick of hearing the word reconciliation over the next 4 years. And the reason why is that that's a very unique opportunity for the Republicans given the fact they control 52 seats. You see, reconciliation is one of those words that has a different meaning inside the Beltway than you and I might assume. When you and I hear the word reconciliation, we assume 2 people who have a genuine disagreement about an issue sit down, lay out their arguments, come to a conclusion that's workable for both parties, and they move on. They reconcile their differences. Well, that's not how reconciliation works inside the Senate. Reconciliation works much more like it does in my own home. When my wife and I have a disagreement, we sit down, we discuss the issue, we put forward our arguments, and I quickly realize she was right all along and we do what she wanted. That's called reconciliation within my household and the Senate in the United States. You see, in the Senate in the United States, it only requires that for a budget issue or a tax issue, that using budget reconciliation, you only need those 51 votes. And clearly the Republicans have those 51 votes. Now, there's another check on a runaway presidential agenda if you're concerned about that or maybe even optimistic about it. The second check on President Trump will be the GOP deficit hawks. How many Republicans have run campaign after campaign after campaign about being a fiscal conservative? We're going to get the debt under control. We're going to start shrinking the budget deficit. Well, I'm here to tell you it's the majority of them. And at the same time, they know that Donald Trump has not necessarily put forward a fiscally conservative agenda. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. He wants to grow deficits through increased spending and decreased tax revenues. Well, that's going to challenge these fiscally conservative Republicans to stand true to the voters that put them in office. I think that's going to be one of the most interesting dynamics we see throughout 2016. But let's get into some of that granularity and talk about some of those legislative agendas. And I want to start by talking about trade. Donald Trump ran on an America First trade platform, and that's not exactly consistent with where the Republicans are. Traditionally, the Republicans have always been much more free trade oriented, not America First. And those two things may very well come to loggerheads throughout 2016. Donald Trump talked about putting on tariffs or trade protectionism throughout his campaign. And the real question is, how much authority does an American president have to implement some of those trade tariff issues? Interestingly, our president in the United States is vested with very few wholesale authorities in our system of governance. However, one area that he has a tremendous amount of flexibility happens to be trade tariffs. If a president believes that there's been a situation of manipulation of a country's currency to favor their imports over a domestic producer, he can put a tariff on that country. If he believes that there's a significant trade imbalance with a country, he can put a trade tariff on that country. If he believes that there's a specific U.S. industry that is being targeted unfairly by a foreign producer, he can put a tariff on that country. If there's an issue of national security, he has the authority to put a tariff on that country. Now, you tell me, how many times did you hear Donald Trump call China a currency manipulator? He has every opportunity and set himself up to label China a currency manipulator. That would allow him to put a tariff on that country's imports. In addition to that, you tell me, what industrialized country do we not have a significant trade imbalance with? As far as protecting a U.S. industry, I have one word and one word only for you: steel. We know China has been dumping underpriced steel on the United States for years and years and years, and Donald Trump, being in the construction industry, has actually benefited from that, but is uniquely positioned to understand that particular issue. So you can see Donald Trump has all the opportunities and set up an agenda where he could actually get into a trade dialogue with these different countries. You see, Donald Trump is not interested in big free trade agreements. He's interested in what's called a bilateral trade agreement, where the United States negotiates specifically with one particular country. We finish that deal, we move on to the next country, and then the next country, and the next country. That allows, in Donald Trump's mind, the ability to negotiate the best deal possible to put America first. Now, this is not rocket science. This is economics 101. If we put trade tariffs or restrictions on imports coming into our country, what are those countries going to do to our exports? They're going to put tariffs on them. The net result of that is a higher cost to consumers and higher inflation. I think that's an economic challenge that Republicans need to be aware of as they're talking about these issues starting here in 2017. Now, we've also heard the Republicans talk a lot about repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act. And I want to talk a little bit about what they can get done and what they can't get done along those areas. Interestingly, as I go around the country and I do client events every week, the Affordable Care Act is still the #1 most consistent source of questions I get from clients. It's absolutely amazing to me, but obviously that's going to ramp up again as we start talking about repealing and replacing. The real challenge for the Republicans is the Affordable Care Act, as a piece of legislation, means it is subject to that filibuster minimum. If you truly want to do away with the entire Affordable Care Act, you need to find 60 votes. Republicans in the Senate. Republicans only control 52. So that means that if they can get all 52 Republicans to actually vote for repeal, they need to find 8 more Democrats to go along with it. Now, inside the Senate, every senator is very concerned about when they are up for re-election once again. Interestingly, there are 10 Democrats up for re-election in 2018 in the Senate in states that Trump won in 2016. That means that's the short list of Democrats that you can look to see if they would be willing to go along with the Republicans to shore up their opportunities in the 2018 election. I think that's a fairly thin margin at that point, so I think total repeal of the Affordable Care Act is very unlikely. What is much more likely is using the process of reconciliation, the budget process, they can get the law from the inside. We know a large part of the Affordable Care Act is based on tax and penalties and budgetary effects. To the extent that those exist within the Affordable Care Act, reconciliation is a viable opportunity to try to rid the country of the Affordable Care Act. For one, they could get rid of the 3.8% tax that funds the Affordable Care Act. Now, I think that's a little bit unlikely. We think the net result of the repeal effort will be a repeal today, but replace some years down the road. In other words, giving the Republicans a few years to come up with what that replacement plan is. I think that will be their strategy, meaning that 3.8% tax, while eventually won't be necessary, I think in the near term could easily remain in place. You could also deal with the subsidies. There are two types of subsidies within the Affordable Care Act. You and I are familiar with the premium subsidies for lower income families to offset the premium cost of their health insurance premium. But how many of you know about the second subsidy inside the Affordable Care Act? For even lower income families, it's a subsidy directly to the insurance companies to artificially lower those families' deductibles and co-payments. How many of you knew that was inside the law? I imagine pretty few of you. And the reality is the saddest part and the most insidious part of that subsidy is that those families don't know that subsidy exists either. Donald Trump, later in January, with a stroke of a pen, could get rid of those subsidies, and all of a sudden their premiums and deductibles would triple or quadruple in order to bring them back up to the amount. In addition to that, the penalties associated with the Affordable Care Act, obviously that's a budgetary issue, and that could be dealt with through reconciliation as well. Now, they couldn't get rid of the penalty inside the law because they would have to change the law, but what they could do is simply not enforce those penalties moving forward. Not dissimilar to the year 2014. But it's also important to understand that the Republicans actually have a lot of agreement with the Affordable Care Act. Some significant areas of agreement with the Republicans and the Democrats is that they agree that every child should have the opportunity to stay on their parents' plan until age 26. In addition to that no family should be subject to pre-existing conditions in trying to access health insurance coverage. And for the most part, all Republicans also agree that there should be no lifetime maximum to those health insurance benefits. Republicans would just like to tweak the remainder part of the law a little bit. For example, they would like to allow insurance companies to sell insurance across state lines. In addition to that, just like employers and employees, we get to deduct the cost of our health insurance premium. The Republicans would like to allow individuals accessing healthcare.gov to be able to deduct those health insurance premiums as well. They'd also like to go to a more major medical type of concept within the Affordable Care Act by lowering the minimum requirements within the plans and enhancing the use of HSAs, health savings accounts, those larger deductible type of plans. So you can see the challenge for the Republicans in 2016 is while they have said all along they want to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, they actually want to keep a large portion and certainly some of the basic tenets of the law. But they have married themselves so closely to the idea of getting rid of Obamacare that that's what's going to cause this political challenge in actually getting done, accomplishing what they're trying to get done this year. Now, in addition to that, we've also heard a lot about the financial regulations and deregulation efforts of Donald Trump and the Republicans. And let's talk about what that means to the financial industry. I think our discussion earlier today was right on as far as longer term. But again, I want to talk a little bit more tactically. In order to understand Donald Trump's position around financial regulation specifically, is you need to understand that yin and yang of Donald Trump, where he ran on a pro-business platform, but he also ran as a populist. And those two things somewhat don't agree when you start talking about financial regulation. Certainly around the Consumer Financial Board, that's one area where the populism may kick in as a concern of, well, why aren't we protecting consumers against banks' inappropriate activity and so forth? Sadly, as an industry, we've had some examples lately that kind of reinforce the value of that type of position. On the DOL, though, it's important to understand that Donald Trump has never mentioned the letters DOL in succession, as far as we know. Certainly not as it relates to the fiduciary standard. And because it's a final reg, that means that you have to go through a very specific process to deal with that issue. Because it's a final reg, if you were just trying to rewrite the reg or start over, you would have to go through the entire regulatory process again. And as you know, that's a very lengthy process. Certainly something that can't get done before April of this year. In addition to that, you could also rely on the legislature. But as was adequately pointed out earlier, that means you would have to rely on an elected official to stand up before his constituents in the entire country and say, yeah, I don't think a financial advisor should have to work in their client's best interest. We think that's a silly idea. And I think the optics of that are quite obvious. But you could also rely on the judiciary. As you know, there are lots of lawsuits coming up questioning the viability and constitutionality of the Department of Labor fiduciary standard. Donald Trump, as President of the United States, could simply instruct the Department of Labor to simply not defend the state's case. And in that situation, they would win, the industry would win those lawsuits and whittle away at that DOL reg. Now, I don't know about you, looking at Donald Trump over the last 18 months, that doesn't really sound very Trumponian. I think Donald Trump likes to take a little more direct type of action. So should the DOL regulation come to the president-elect's attention and he chooses to do something about it, we think the most likely scenario would be something we call an interim final reg. That's an area where the president has a little bit of latitude, where the president could simply issue an interim final regulation saying we plan on going through the complete regulatory process to get rid of or significantly modify the DOL fiduciary standard, but we simply don't have time to get it done before April. So Department of Labor, I'm issuing this interim final reg to kick off the effective date of implementation of the DOL to give us time to go through that process. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot more Trumponian than the other judiciary standard. Now, along those lines, though, it's very important to understand, and this, I think, was adequately pointed out again earlier today, is bottom line, if it is a priority for Trump, he could deal with it. The question is, we have no idea whether it's a priority for him or not. I think you would agree he's set a pretty full plate for the next 180 days of his presidency, and I certainly think the DOL final or fiduciary standard is in there somewhere. I just don't know the priority level, and neither do you. So we have to keep going under the assumption that that DOL fiduciary standard will go in as it is written right now. Now, let's take this discussion one step further. While we don't have a lot of details as to a lot of Donald Trump's proposals, one area that we do have a lot more detail is around tax reform. Very excitingly, we anticipate fully that we're going to talk about tax reform this year and are likely to see some significant changes. So I thought it'd be valuable to spend some time along those areas. You see, that's where there's been a tectonic shift in Washington, D.C. The old discussion around tax reform was between Democrat and Republican. Democrats' position is that tax reform should increase revenues to the federal government, where Republicans' position was that it should be a revenue-neutral exercise. In other words, not add to nor take away revenue from our federal government. But now with Donald Trump coming into the White House, there's that tectonic shift, where Donald Trump is saying, no, tax reform should reduce revenues to the federal government, while a lot of Republicans are still in a revenue-neutral position on tax reform. That's the new dialogue of tax reform moving forward. While it's important to understand that every single time you talk about tax reform, there are by definitions winners and losers. That's where you and I can create opportunities. Now, where there's a lot of agreement is Donald Trump has conceded to the Republican proposal of coming down to 3 tax brackets, and you can see those listed here, both for ordinary and earned income as well as capital gains. But when we drill down a little bit deeper into the Republican and Donald Trump tax proposal, there are some other things in addition to those lower marginal rates. For example, that 3.8% tax that funds the Affordable Care Act, they would ultimately like to get rid of it. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure that's going to happen because that would assume the entire Affordable Care Act goes away day one. But in addition to that, they would also like to eliminate the AMT, the alternative minimum tax. After all, if you've just gone through a tax reform process, then why do you need an alternative way to calculate someone's tax liability? What they'd also like to do is repeal the estate tax, but not dissimilar to what it was like back in 2010. Yes, the estate tax would go away, but you would also lose stepped-up basis for wealthiest Americans. Estates right now, what's being proposed is our estates over $10 million will lose that stepped-up basis. So again, that may be some opportunities for estate planning at that point as well. Now, interestingly, something that's tucked inside of Donald Trump and his tax proposal is that higher net worth, higher income individuals should also lose the tax-deferred buildup inside of life insurance products. That was a little bit of a surprise there. We do not believe that's something that would likely move forward. The wonderful thing about our industry is that we have a very strong presence in Washington, D.C., as we've heard all morning. And we're busily educating the Washington and the legislators on the value of these types of products. And you've heard a little bit about this earlier this morning. There is one thing that the federal government is extremely paranoid about. The one thing they're extremely paranoid about is that the average American has done a very poor job of saving for their own retirement. So they don't want to do anything to discourage an American saving for retirement. We know that that's already a big challenge. If you do any work in 401ks or have work with people that work inside the 401k industry, you know their biggest problem is participation and meaningful participation. So why would the federal government want to do anything to discourage an American saving for their own retirement? That's where our lobby has been very effective in trying to educate legislators. Now we're trying to educate regulators. The DOL is a good example of that. I think the area that's most likely to move forward more quickly than individual tax reform will be corporate tax reform. And there's some interesting things here that we need to understand. First of all, Donald Trump would lower the corporate maximum rate from the current 35% to 15%, a huge drop in those marginal rates. But more importantly, he would apply that to pass-through business owners. My business is an LLC. So while I'm a person, I'm taxed at the personal level, I'm actually a business. But now my maximum tax bracket would go from the current 39.6 plus the 3.8 down to 15% plus that 3.8% tax. So that's a huge tax decrease for an individual like me. Now, one area of complete disagreement between the Republicans and Donald Trump is around this idea of a worldwide tax system. You see, what Donald Trump wants to move to is what's called a worldwide tax system. And pardon me while I digress here for a moment. See, a worldwide tax system tells Apple, hey, Apple, good for you for selling that iPhone in Australia this year. I know you made a little profit on the sale of that phone. I don't care what you do with that profit. Do whatever you want with it. But because you're a U.S. domiciled corporation, you pay U.S. taxes this year on that profit, no matter whether you repatriate it or not. That's called a worldwide tax system. Now, the Republicans want to go the polar opposite direction. They want to move to what's called a territorial tax system. And a territorial tax system is quite a bit different. It tells Apple, good for you, Apple, for selling that iPhone in Australia this year. I know you made a little profit on the sale of that phone. Good for you. Do whatever you want with that profit. I don't care. Leave it offshore, bring it back on shore. It doesn't matter. You will never pay a U.S. tax on that profit because you made it in Australia, not the United States. So you can see there's a big disconnect there between Republicans and Democrats. Or excuse me, between Republicans and Donald Trump. What Donald Trump and the Republicans would also like to move forward on is something called immediate expensing. Right now, as a business owner, if I buy a piece of capital equipment to improve my efficiency in my business, I get to depreciate that over its useful lifespan. It's a great tax advantage for me as a business owner. But what the Republicans would like me to do is to be able to have the choice of writing off the entire cost of that capital purchase in the year that I made it. For example, if I was an earth-moving company and I needed to buy a new bulldozer, right now I have to depreciate that over its useful lifespan, maybe 10, 15, 20 years. But what Donald Trump and the Republicans like to do is to give me the option to write off 100% of that capital purchase, that bulldozer, this year. So, ladies and gentlemen, going around talking with clients, and a lot of our clients, as you know, are business owners, a lot of them tell me, Jeff, I've got cash in my pocket. As a business owner, I know where I would invest that cash. I know exactly what I would buy, and I know the top line growth in my business for implementing that capital purchase. What I don't have a lot of confidence on is the bottom line increase in my position by making that capital purchase because of tax uncertainty. So by allowing these business owners to give them tax certainty and immediate expensing, theoretically would unlock a lot of that cash inside our business owners around the United States. In addition to that, we've also heard that there's trillions of dollars in corporate earnings sitting offshore not being taxed in the United States. Donald Trump and the Republicans would like to repatriate those trillions of dollars back on U.S. soil and tax it at an artificially low 10% rate. Now, by all accounts, there's $2 to $2.5 trillion of corporate earnings sitting offshore. So, simple math, $2.5 trillion times 10%, that's $250 billion in new revenue to the federal government. Now, quick show of hands, how many of you think $250 billion is a lot of money? Anyone? Anyone? Let me introduce you to Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, $250 billion, while certainly is a lot of money, it represents less than 1/2 of 1 year's annual budget deficit. It's a lot of money, but it's not going to be a windfall and change the trajectory of our country financially. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump has already decided how he wants to spend that $250 billion, so don't get too excited about getting your share of it. Well, the Republicans would also like to end carried interest. I think that's been in the Republican proposal and the Democratic proposals for the last decade. We think once we're into a corporate tax reform discussion, that certainly is something that would change. Now, go back to my original discussion, though. Our original discussion is should tax reform be a revenue-neutral exercise, or should it decrease tax revenues? That will be the big debate amongst the Republicans as we move through this tax reform discussion. And should it be a revenue-neutral experience, these are the big movers in those numbers. These are the big holes that the Republicans will have to try to fill in order to make this revenue-neutral. And ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about significant money here. Even with the most optimistic scoring of the impact of these numbers, it still will add about $3 trillion to our budget deficit above and beyond the debt we are already anticipating adding over the next 10 years. It's a significant amount of money. Now, if you're going to talk about tax revenues, i.e. revenue to the federal government, you also have to talk about expenditures. And Donald Trump has already said he wants to rebuild the U.S. military. He wants to spend a lot more money on defense spending. But he also wants to do a big jobs bill. And Donald Trump's big jobs bill is actually an infrastructure redevelopment program. Donald Trump has said that he wants to increase infrastructure spending by as much as $1 trillion over the next 10 years, $250 billion of which would come from the repatriation of those monies offshore. The idea is that an infrastructure development plan, generally those are great blue-collar jobs, high-income blue-collar jobs, so it would work as a job stimulus program, a jumpstart, if you will, into growing our economy once again. But you see, if we're going to talk about tax or spending, we need to understand the fiscal realities that we face right now. You see, 2016 was a watershed year. It was a watershed year because it was the first year in 8 years we started to grow our budget deficit once again. As a matter of fact, the federal budget deficit was projected as of January of last year that we'd end somewhere around $544 billion of annual budget deficit. That's 2.9% of GDP. But the CBO said, be careful though, understand long term, it's expected by 2022 it'll be up to 4.4% of GDP. And by 2026 it'll be up to 4.9%. Ladies and gentlemen, this is before the $3 trillion in additional debt that Donald Trump wants to add to our spending. I'm not saying it's a bad spend, I'm just suggesting that we need to understand what it is. As a matter of fact, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, the people that put these numbers together, they actually updated their numbers. We don't have the final year ends for 2016, but we have a good estimation. They came to us in September and they said, you know, we missed our mark a little bit. We thought it'd be around $544 billion. We actually are going to end the year closer to $590 billion. In other words, they missed their mark 10% to the bad side, meaning we're adding debt much faster than they had projected. It's expected now that by 2026, the publicly held debt will reach 85.5% of GDP. Now, does anybody know the last time in U.S. history we were at those levels or above? World War II. And while I appreciate the CBO putting this little slide together, this graph, I think it kind of gives us an artificial feeling of confidence. If you look at this graph, you say, well, yeah, I know it's growing, Jeff, but it's not growing that much. It almost makes you think that that mid 70% is long-term normal. But sadly, that's not the case. Does anybody know what the actual long-term publicly held debt to GDP ratio is? About 38%. You see, we're already twice the long-term average and trending the wrong direction. As a matter of fact, if you take a step back and look at a longer-term projection of where our debt's going, you see a very concerning trend. And that's the reality we have to deal with, given any decision we make today. Our country, as great as it is an aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean. If we need to turn that aircraft carrier to get to this island, the sooner we start turning and dealing with the realities of these numbers, the easier that turn's going to be. And we need to reconcile that as a country. You see, there's just a fundamental disagreement between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats believe that capitalism, by definition, favors the wealthy, and that the federal government has an active role in redistributing that wealth. The current modus operandi of the Democratic Party is to redistribute that wealth via the progressivity of the U.S. tax code. Wealthier Americans disproportionately sharing in any tax increase. Well, Republicans quickly retort. They say Democrats have it all wrong. It's all about economic growth. Anything that we do as a federal government to overburden job creators or wealth creators only thwarts that growth. We need to be backing ourselves out of that equation. And right now we know who won that theoretical argument, at least for the next 4 years. Republicans have won that tax dialogue. We know we're heading to a lower marginal tax rate environment. I love this slide. It shows the long-term highest marginal tax bracket in the modern U.S. tax history. I'll come back to this slide here in a moment, and you'll see why I love it so much. You see, in my humble opinion, and as it was pointed out earlier by Greg and so forth, is that the value of advice moving forward has never been more valuable. Anytime we're in a period of inflection, that's when value of advice increases. Only if you understand what that value is defined by. And in my humble opinion, the value of advice moving forward has changed a bit. We used to value our advice based on asset allocation. I don't think that's accurate any longer. We've kind of made a science out of asset allocation. You can go to any website on the internet and get asset allocation. But where there's value created is marrying the right asset allocation to the right asset location. And asset location is based on my unique tax situation. Let me give you an example. I'm a 50-year-old guy. Let's say I make $300 grand a year. But your client, your financial advisor, has another male client, 50 years old, making the same $300,000 a year. Only one difference between these two clients. I own my own business. That client's a W-2 employee. Now, we both have 15 years until retirement, so we should have roughly the same asset allocation, right? Allocation's about time frame. But if that financial advisor has us in the same asset location, they're committing malpractice. They're committing malpractice because our tax realities are so completely different. And value is created by not providing tax advice. We can't do that. But by God, knowing that client's tax situation well enough to properly advise them on asset location, that's value in the future. You see, we've managed asset volatility through asset allocation. What I'm suggesting is the value in the future is managing tax volatility. And it goes right to my retirement strategy, what I call my 3-bucket strategy. You see, when I retire, I want 3 equal buckets of money. I want a bucket of taxable, a bucket of tax-free, and a bucket of tax-deferred. That way, I get to manipulate the tax code for my lifestyle rather than the tax code tell me what my lifestyle will be. Here's the sad reality that none of us have any control on whatsoever. We know the average client's going to spend 30 to 35 years in retirement, right? You tell me. What 30 years is that client going to spend in retirement? What's their tax rate going to be over that 30, 35-year period? The reality is your financial advisors don't know, you don't know, the client doesn't know. Nobody knows. That's why there's value there. There's value because it's about having a multitude of income generation opportunities in retirement so the client can manipulate the tax code for their lifestyle rather than be dictated to them. One of my biggest concerns for Americans heading to retirement, to the extent that they have saved for retirement, is that almost 100% of their savings is in one place. Where is it? 401k IRA. One tax strategy when they retire. I think value for higher income, higher net worth people moving forward is educating them on that reality and helping them in a lower tax rate environment take advantage of after-tax saving. Right? I would argue that right now you ought to be pumping more of those after-tax savings once those tax rates come down. I think based on that graph, you can see we're historically rather low. So at the same time, we have to marry that with long-term care planning. I think as an industry, we missed the mark so horribly in the 90s when we started talking about retirement planning over here and then long-term care planning over here. We made a major mistake. You tell me, how can you do a good retirement plan for a client and not talk about long-term care? When something is as likely to impact 1/3 of retirees in retirement, and we know it's a big ticket item, it is a retirement issue and should be a part of that retirement discussion. Correct me if I'm wrong, but our industry has some pretty good solutions in those environments. As it relates to interest rates, obviously in a rising interest rate environment, you probably want to shorten that duration and shorten that interest rate risk on that end. Now, rarely do we actually give tactical advice into markets, but we think because we're in a unique inflection point as it relates to tax environment, we thought it'd be interesting to go through some industries that we think advantaged in this environment and some that may have some challenges. For example, domestic industrials, based on the infrastructure spend that we know is going to come through the Republican proposal and the immediate expensing, should do very well in this coming tax environment. Traditional energy should also do well. We know Donald Trump's an all of the above kind of guy, and he's certainly going to clear the way for more traditional sources of energy creation. Defense will do well through that build-up, but also through immediate expensing. Financial services should do well in a lower regulatory environment or a rethought out regulatory environment, as we talked about earlier, as well as interest rates rising. And consumer discretionary, all that means is that consumers, you and I, are going to have more money in our pocket. And what does the average American do when they have a little more money in their pocket? They spend it on discretionary items. Now, a couple industries I'll make you aware of that I think may be a little more challenged in this environment. One is technology. We talked about that offshoring of corporate profits and going to potentially a worldwide tax rate environment. That would significantly impact the technology industry. Technology is the king of offshoring those profits, and they would suffer the most in that type of environment. At the same time, healthcare and pharmaceuticals could also be challenged in a positive and a negative way as we talk about repealing or replacing the Affordable Care Act, but they could also do well by decreased regulation. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in our mind around healthcare or pharmaceuticals. So with that, we've got about 2 minutes or 3 minutes for questions. I know that's not a lot. I apologize. I was hoping we might have a little more time, but maybe time for 1 or 2 questions on something I skipped over too quickly or maybe I didn't get to. Anything? Yes, sir. Yeah, the question was take a step back out of domestic politics into more global politics and what direction it's heading there. Clearly, the world has moved in a more populist direction. I think that's an undeniable trend in this process that we've seen going back, I would argue, all the way back to Tiananmen Square in China, was this development of this more populism. That's not something unique to the 21st century. These populist swings have happened throughout U.S. history, or throughout the world history, pardon me. And when you see those big populist moves, that's when things get redefined. So I think it's a very interesting time globally to watch these things play out. I'm not as concerned about it domestically, where you have a fairly robust infrastructure designed to deal with these ebbs and flows. But when you start talking about less developed countries, emerging markets, and things like that, I think that's where you could see a lot of volatility in those, and we already have throughout the Middle East through the Arab Spring. Did that touch on what you were referring to? Thank you. Anything else? Okay, real quickly, I want to thank Eaton Vance, obviously, for sponsoring me here on the road today. But a lot of people will say, well, Jeff, how do you stay in touch with, or how can we stay in touch with what you and Andy are talking about? You can certainly go to our website. You can sign up for our free updates. As the name implies, they are free. There are many white papers that we'll send out, maybe 8, 10 of those a year. But in addition to that, more tactically than that, I'll send out 1 or 2 articles a day using all of our social media. Again, there's no cost to anything there. And it's just an article that we think is uniquely interesting in our reading today that we wanted to share with you. The guarantee I'll make you is this. I know your financial reading is about that deep, and I can't do anything about it, but I can take your political and tax reading. And this year is going to be a very dynamic year in those spaces. So to the extent that I can keep you abreast of those high line items, I do that via these social media feeds. So whatever system you use, Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever, just follow us and you'll see that article or 2 a day come out. So again, I want to thank Eaton Vance for having me here today. This is an unbelievably impressive meeting. I do tons of national sales meetings and annual meetings and things like this. I can honestly say, and I know this sounds like I'm pandering, but I have never seen anything like this. You're a great firm. Jackson is a fabulous partner for me. I certainly look forward to working with you more in the future. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your meeting.